Hi there. Welcome to one of Birch Bark Editing's most fabulous offerings, which is to say it's our In Conversation series. I'm Kat Parnell, and I'm a Birch Bark co-founder along with Maxie Jane Fraser. We're thrilled that you're all here this evening. We are, as I said, we're Birch Bark Editing, and there's a lot going on with Birch Bark. We have a couple of workshops coming up in October. Our Mix and Meet gathers in early October, and then in late September, we're offering a Moments in Miniature class. So if you'd like to sign up for that, please check our website. And as always, we appreciate your support in any form. Applause is always good. It's my great pleasure to present two of my favorite poets this evening, Judith Baumel and Rachel Hadas. A few words about the poets. Judy's books are The Weight of Numbers, for which she won the Walt Whitman Award of the Academy of American Poets. Now, The Kangaroo Girl, and I'm going to mispronounce this, Passagate, and Thorny. She is Professor Emerita of English and founding director of the Creative Writing Program at Adelphi University. She has served as president of the Association of Writers and Writing Programs and director of the Poetry Society of America and a Fulbright scholar in Italy. Rachel is the author of many books of poetry, essays, and translations. Her latest collection is Pandemic Almanac, and that's preceded by Love and Dread, poems, and Piece by Piece, prose. The recipient of honors, including a Guggenheim Fellowship in Poetry, she is Board of Governors Professor of English at Rutgers University, Newark, where she's taught for many years. So please join me in welcoming Judy and Rachel, and I will turn things over to them.
Thank you, Kat. It's a pleasure to be here with these two dynamic women. And if I can say, we've had the pleasure of being in a weekly Zoom talking about Ovid's Metamorphoses for most of this year. So I've learned that Kat knows how to shoot a rattlesnake and all kinds of other things, which I will never forget. I don't know that I need to say anything else, except that it's really a thrill to be here. Judy?
I'm thrilled too. Rachel and I go a little bit back, and she's constant inspiration to me. For one thing, she's prolific in the best sense, and she's so smart, and her work is beautiful. So it's a great honor to be reading with you. Thank you for Thank you for your work. And I think that I can't remember, but I do believe we agreed that you'd go first, and I'm gonna silence myself, and when you're finished reading, I'll read a few poems, and then we'll have a nice chat.
That's the plan. And okay, I'm going to read 4 poems from Pandemic Almanac, and it was hard to decide what to read, but I won't belabor that. The first poem is about the beginning, or just before the beginning of the pandemic. The last poem is about the end, which has not clearly arrived, as we all know. And the 2 poems in the middle, one of them is about a dream, because Judy is interested in my use of dreams, and one of them is in couplets, because Judy had expressed interest in that. So if you have the book, the very first poem in it is called February 29th, 2020, which was Leap Day. And as it happened, I was teaching a poetry workshop that day. If you can cast your mind 2.5 years back to that day, I think we might all remember, if not that day, what the beginning or before the beginning felt like. We'll talk about Almanac later, but I do date these poems, not my usual practice. So this is New York, February 2020. As if we knew, but didn't know we knew. February 29th, Leap Day, an extra day, an ordinary day, predictable even in being extraordinary, a bonus day in the old dispensation we couldn't guess was close to termination. When did we start to sense the great subtraction? Leap Day then, and I was on my way to catch a train to go to Tarrytown, people still had a schedule and a plan mapping the hours to their destination to run a 4-hour class on poetry, specifically tailored to the day on poems that performed a lyric leap, the way the mind hopscotches A to C or D or Z, a little lateral hop or skip, a sudden swerve, a syncopation. I waited for the train, Grand Central Station, tourists and travelers in circulation, all of them aimed at some desired location, throngs chatting, texting, pausing to gaze up at the iconic ceiling's constellations. A pregnant woman in a scarlet coat posed for a photo with a selfie stick. Her baby must be 2 years old by now. Waiting for my train, could I foresee crowds would soon be prohibited by law? Could anyone imagine the Great Hall would within weeks be scoured clean of all humanity? Just dust motes in the sun, idle tracks, an empty waiting room. Whoever sensed it didn't want to see. That extra day, that ordinary day, I got where I was going on the train and taught the lyric leap as per the plan. Then, tired, happy, bathed in poetry, caught a train and traveled back again, retraced my steps, Grand Central one more time. Maybe make that Grand Central one last time. Looking back now, I saw that leap day when we leapt with poetry, the cold blue morning light, the dappled sky, the river silver gray as we rode by. But what no one was prepared to see, not quite a harbinger since it was there already. No, a searchlight raked the air invisibly, masked by morning's glare. That searchlight still is searching everywhere, and everyone's a target, you and me. And yet with the bewilderment and fear, upheaval on a scale we scarcely see, even though we sense it in the air, companion to our stunned anxiety, something else persists invisibly, something that isn't going anywhere, something that is still here. Maybe in the Q&A, I'll say a word about the end of that poem, which I actually edited a bit. Okay, the second poem is called Trying to Get to School. And the dates are the dates these poems are about, and more or less the dates they're written, but the dream that forms the backbone of this poem was, as dreams often are, somehow a prophetic dream. So the dream would have been dreamed in the months before lockdown. Dream. Halfway to my destination, I remembered something I'd forgotten and turned around so I could get it back before it was too late. But making my way from A to B could not be managed easily. Locked courtyard, blocked alleys, a high wall. I had to cross or climb them all. I tried and tried without success. Wherever I turned, no access, no way to reach the subway station and get from there to my destination, across the river and into a room I'd open the door to. What was Zoom? Enter, talk, listen, and engage with my students, forgetting age, and tell them before time ran out what reading and writing were about. Gathered together in one place to talk and listen face to face. This, my dream was telling me, was something that could no longer be. Henceforth, it wouldn't be allowed to be a part of any crowd. Locked courtyards and blocked alleyways, our isolated nights and days, no hands held up or questions asked, the eager faces muffled, masked, all siloed in our separate spaces and interposed between us, stasis. I knew already there was no way to get where I had to go. The dream I dreamed 6 months ago, prophetic but no longer true. Now crowds have gathered, still masked, yes, but shouting against voicelessness. The streets are full, the atmosphere ardent, insistent. Where is fear? Forgotten in the hope and flow. Justice is contagious too. So that actually locates it in the moments after and the weeks and months after the George Floyd murder, which I'd in fact forgotten, but that is a kind of sideways reference. Judy uses allusion much more clearly than I do, I would say. This third poem is one of many poems that we are seeing now about Zoom as a medium, Zoom as a metaphor, Zoom as an experience. I would mention in particular Mary Jo Salter's wonderful new book, Zoom Rooms, the center of which is a crown of sonnets all about Zoom and not only teaching on Zoom. So this is from the end of the fall semester 2020. It's called In the Cloud. And obviously that has a sort of metaphoric valence too. Originally, it had an extremely uninspired title, The List, because the poem was generated by a list I made, which I talk about in the beginning. But In the Cloud seemed to be a better title. And Judy had mentioned my couplets, and I'll talk more about them later, but this poem is in couplets, although you've already heard plenty of rhyme in what I've read. In the Cloud. I made a list I can't find now. Where did all my folders go? Of words my students didn't know. Turmeric, poultice, fallacy, cadence, meringue, Antigone, last but not least, Persephone, are just a few that stick with me, plucked from the poems that we read. I tried to stay a week ahead between September and December. Many more I don't remember. But think of all the words they knew or thought they knew. I thought so too. Thinking too hard, though, doesn't do. Words deeply pondered start to freeze, as when before our tired eyes Zoom stalls and stops and no surprise, leaving a dark screen, a blank hour to fill with after and before. Nonsense syllables devour denotations. Happy, sad, joyful or lonely, good or bad. What does this mean to you? I said. What does beautiful really mean? I asked them as I tried to lean into the non-committal screen, scanning until my eyes were sore for the soul in each black square. Were there really people there? Did each name hide a secret face, sheltering somewhere in place, some unimaginable space? Each word they may have learned from me in Gen Ed, reading poetry, carries its meaning quietly, concealed behind the livid glow of all we learned we didn't know. Alone together, here we are, stranded in our shared nowhere, marooned in space, while free from time, meanings proliferate and chime as words unfettered dance and rhyme. Couple of references there. I think everybody's familiar with the phenomenon whereby if you keep saying a word over and over, it stops meaning anything. One person who's written really well about that is James Thurber, a humorist who might not be as familiar to younger people as he would be to people my age, but he talks about words going through his head until they don't mean anything. And then the phrase alone together is actually the title of a book by a brilliant Radcliffe classmate of mine, Sherry Turkle, who teaches at MIT and who was talking about the effects of the effects of technology long before the pandemic, and that sense of being alone even as you're together. The last poem I'll read is sort of about the end of the pandemic, but as I say sort of, because are we at the end and where is the end? And indeed, this book could have been much longer, but I felt at a certain point there was a cutoff point. And it's one of two poems in the book that allude to Plato's myth of the cave, because that seemed very relevant to lockdown and to Zoom as well, that people who are living in an underground cavern and only see shadows don't have any sense of what the world outside looks like. But what particularly got to me when I was revisiting this passage in Plato's Republic is that once they're taken outside and allowed to look up, many of them are alarmed and want to go back into the cave again. I don't even have to comment on that phenomenon, but Plato saw it pretty clearly. So this is March 2021. There was a time when we thought we would all emerge and then we all had to scuttle back in again. So there's been that kind of shoveling experience. The cave again, because there's a longer poem earlier in the book called The Cave. Described by Plato, now it's much the same, the underworld we're comfortable in. Our fetters fit us like a second skin, enchanted by the caperings on screen and never by the hidden source of light, the fire behind us or the naked sun. We know each shadow perfectly by name. Our children don't remember other ways. We think we do. It's only been a year. We think so, but the past's abstract and far, ungraspable and tiny as a star glimpsed from a distance of unnumbered days. Up on the surface, dazzled by the glare, squinting, stumbling, only gradually able to make out moonlight, water, tree, and gulping in the strange and strong fresh air. How could some poor prisoners not rebel if forced to leave their subterranean womb? Would most not scuttle back to their dark room, resist the power dragging them uphill? Will we resurface? Some of us, few, all. The second spring approaches. Time will tell. So that's my 4 poems. Thank you for listening. Over to Judy.
Hi, thank you. Wow. Hearing them in your voice, the rhythms and the complexity. But I have a question for later. I'll be reading 4 poems also. I'm trying something new, which is I'm going to try to read from my screen. I hope I've made some notes for myself. The first poem I'm going to read, in fact, the first 2 poems I'm going to read take place in Syracuse, Sicily. It's a very ancient city. There's a Greek theater that Aeschylus's plays had their debuts in, and there's a lot of mythical Greek allusions in these poems, but also Syracuse was a place of early Christianity. And there's a sarcophagus of one particular woman that I found just gorgeous, and she's posing with her husband. They're both on top in this sort of Etruscan style funeral pose, but only she is inside the sarcophagus. The little medallion says it's only her. So I was thinking about that. The title of my book comes from this poem. Thorny here is a way to think about marriage. And nevertheless, this is a love poem to my husband. The name of the poem is taken from the medallion naming the woman, and her name is Adelphia, hic Adelphia clarissima femina. Here lies Adelphi, Rachel will translate this better for me, a important woman, a good woman. I want to look this way and be looked at this way, turned toward each other, but askew, as if the planes of our shoulders were made for different vanishing points, and still impose flesh on each other's flesh, me embracing and presenting him, one hand draping a shoulder, the other across his upper arm. Both heads alert, but at rest. The way I find him in sleep from another country, a momentary act of will, crossing the border to seek that sheltering coast, the smell of his skin under white Dalmatian wool. As I will enter my niche alone, these vignettes testify the thorny labor of marriage and its rare yield. They testify as St. Paul preached here and Pelagius teaches. Eve, eating in the garden, is already covering herself, and Adam is guided from behind by Yahweh, present in the breezy time of the day. Good in evil, evil in good. When he damned the soil into which we return, Yahweh gave us the mercy of pains in birth and bread. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego refused fear. May my sons likewise be skillful in all wisdom to stand untouched by fire, dew washed and reborn as a shell. The next poem takes place in the center by the port of Syracuse, and I am scrolling. This is my... I thought this might work nicely, but it takes place there, and it's at a place called the Fountain of Arethusa. Arethusa was a water nymph who was raped in Greek mythology and chased by chased through and under the world. I am sorry to do this, but I will never set this up again. So scrolling, we visited in a very, very hot day, and in order to get to the little fountain, which was filthy, we had to go underground through a little underground aquarium, and it was the custodian of this was a really tall, really beautiful trans woman who made me think about transformations and metamorphoses and how we live that way. So this is called Passeggiata in Siracusa, walk in Syracuse. I've got two characters speaking. They're named Calliope, who's the muse of epic poetry, and she sort of represents me. And the other character is Arethusa herself, talking about what happened to her. Calliope: she took our money and drew a key from a pocket in her dress. The guard, we saw plainly, wasn't very good, though goodness couldn't have been her goal. She could have shaved her cheek closer, spread the foundation better, taken in a seam, straightened her hem. For the goddess's sake, her 6-foot frame needed practice in her 4-inch heels. We passed aquarium tanks in the underground passage to the brilliant outdoors, where the once honored flood was putrid pool, pond of papyrus fronds, cradling chip wrappers and polystyrene. It was ringed by duck shit, damp enough to be composing into small, pungent puddles. Arethusa says, I was restored to air thinking I'd escaped. Where lust turned liquid, Alpheus approached. Once I withstood the improbable mix of salt and fresh and made my own. Boundary. Time diminishes, space disrupts, earthquakes, planners, politics, economies change, where change and difference and definition are fluid illusion. The glass defending water is never solid. Calliope finishes the poem. On the way out, she spritzed the window cleaner on one tank's face and passed a paper towel across the grime. As if a fish inside me had darted down to the muck and back up through swirling silt. Instantly, my stomach muddled. I knew I was sick. The middle section of my book is a collection of Jewish women's voices in the 20th century. And it's called The American Cousins from A to Z. And I would like to read the poem about cousin A. It's the first, it's actually, it's the second one in the chapter, but it's A. And it's a very different tone, I guess, for me. It's about family life. And it's called A, Good Shabbos. No use crying, no use at all. Cousin A dipped the ladle into the well of soup bubbling, a simmer, and my gaze was as ice needles. She drew out the broth, milk of human kindness, mother's milk, broth of vengeance. She stood over the pot, boiling, you can't, a calf in its mother's milk, boil, you can't, rage off the bone, as she returned to the lip, a dip over a cliff. And the last poem I'm going to read is the last poem in the book. I'm reading it because there are some former students here, and it's about my life as a student at Harvard, of Robert Lowell, among others, and of a great art historian named Jean Boggs. And I think I'm going to find it soon. I'm sorry. And if there's anything unusual language-wise in this poem, it's because I've stolen it from different Robert Lowell poems. And it's what do I want to say? Until I find it, until I scroll through to this. Never mind. I'm going to have to ask a young person to help me do this again for another time. So thank you all. The title of the poem is Gueule de Bois, which is French for hangover. And it takes its main thought from a painting of Suzanne Valadon that's in the Fogg Art Museum by Toulouse-Lautrec. And Dr. Boggs I wrote my paper for her on this painting. So I'm thinking about her. Gueule de Bois, The Hangover, Suzanne Valadon by Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. The hair of the dog, mementos, what has been, what will be. The bottle's got wine, the glass does too. Plenty of mistakes we see coming and can't stop, won't stop. Of this painting, Professor Boggs taught the shape of the whole mirrors the shapes of the parts. The rhythms of my teachers fundamentally, irrevocably, hysterically, adverbially shaped me. Bronzed, breezy, a shade too ruddy. That's Robert Lowell in Terminal Days at Beverly Farms. Lowell's drinker is killing time. There's nothing else, he says at first, but 34 lines later, he asks, is he killing time? Each week, Lowell pushed through the crowd on Mass Ave toward Levitt and Pierce for his cigarettes before the bone-crushing surge we created, converging on the seminar room in Holyoke Center, a high floor between the infirmary and those sun-ruined Rothkos in the corporation's dining room. 30 plus years later, I can't determine how the hangover went after my college flirtation. The scotch went down. I remember the acquired taste of acquiring it. Now a hangover is about time, operational time and Poincaré's time, imprints, pentimenti, cyclical returns, somatic memory, the way wine brings the taste of its own history, earth and sun and casks, and the memory of successive samples, the way the smell and the pour bring distant ghosts forward to the spilled circle, bring regret and promises to bear against the future, as if it were the moment before some car smashes through the walls of this cafe, as if a parking meter outside were ever clicking down to 0 time, as if perhaps the future just proceeds upon the street, the cold of April rain on the rangy disappointments of Forsythia. Thanks. So, Kat, are we just jumping in there on our questions? Oh,
Yes, please. I know you have some good questions. Thank you, both of you.
so another reason why I read this last poem was I spent a lot of time thinking about time in this poem, and you spent a lot of time thinking about time in Pandemic Almanac. And in fact, the title, Rachel, is a kind of way of marking time. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you approached that when you were putting the book together.
I'm not sure almanac is quite right, but I wanted to avoid journal. Of course, journal means day by day. And a lot of my poems, and not only these poems, mention the month, or, it's a full moon, it's April, it's a cold January. I was sort of startled by how often that turns up in my poems, though not always. And I felt strongly that these poems fitted together. As I get older, it gets easier to put books together. Maybe they're not all the best poems, but I want to make it a sort of a discrete shape. And living in Vermont, a lot of that time, I paid attention to months and the time of day and the light. It seems to me that your use of time is more historical, like that wonderful reference in the last poem to 30 years later. And you give us so many historical clues and geographical clues. Mine seems to be more kind of vague. I don't know if that's helpful. But again, I wasn't alone in wanting to record something during the pandemic. I mean, so clearly, there are so many books that in one way or another, people have kept going by keeping track.
Right. Although one of the things that feels so right about the way you keep track is that you're often pausing to say, where am I? What time is it? When, where? And you're doing two things at once. You're looking for time markers like the full moon or the way the light comes down.
Yeah.
But you're so often pausing yourself to say, has it actually been a month? Is it a year? Where are we? And that's so, it's so palpable, and it was a thing to record, because the minute I went through this book, I thought, yes, that was what it was like. You don't even know what day of the week it is anymore, because you're not doing anything that requires knowing the day of the week.
And again, these are very, very common experiences, right? Time either collapsed or it's stretched.
Yes, right. And simultaneously. And so I thought that was really pretty deft and terrific, because it put me right back in that spot. But
if you wanted to be there.
well, you know what I thought? I wanted to be there with you. It made me think what a how important it was to have companionship in that time. And there's towards the end of you have a few poems where you're writing to specific people,
right.
And lots of people write to certain people, but the feeling was, you friends, you're my lifeline. You're keeping me going.
I think that's true. And I think poets, as Elizabeth Bishop said, keep each other warm by writing to each other. And that's never been truer than during the pandemic. And also, just to bring it out from just me or the pandemic or just Judy, poetry helps us to capture a moment in time and to collapse time and also to pass time. We all had a lot of time on our hands, at least some of us did. So all of those different things, I didn't want to waste time. There's a poem in Pandemic Almanac called Still. And if you think about the different meanings of the word still in English as an adjective, as an adverb, I'm not saying still as a noun where you make liquor, but as it got to be November of 2020 and we were still in Vermont, people would say, "Are you still here?" And every poet knows how annoying it is to be asked, "Are you still writing? Are you still teaching? Are you still alive?" And I stole, Judy and I both like literary illusion. T.S. Eliot writes, "Teach us to care and not to care, teach us to sit still." And the idea of being and not doing. So all of those different senses of time. As I said, Judy, who is a very powerful poetic user of allusion, is more apt to allude to specific places and times than I think I am. We do it differently.
Yeah.
We both do it.
Yeah. So that gets me to something else. Let me throw this out as a proposal of a comparison between us. I've always loved the way you use dreams in your work, and I particularly love them here because the dreams add yet another layer of where am I, what time is it, what's going on. I think you read dreams in your poems, meaning among the many things you read when you're writing are your own dreams, and I think other people's dreams. There are a couple of shared dreams, and I think I just read history books. That's what I'm reading, and it's sort of my way of getting through something is just to read about something that happened a very long time ago.
Not a problem, Judy. I don't know. I think I'm not much of a storyteller. I have no talent for narrative, and sometimes dreams give me a little bit of a storyline, as in trying to get to school. At other times, there's a poem in here called Mysterious Microclimates, and there's a repeated line in it. "In the middle of the morning, the dream came back." The way we remember just fragments of dreams. And I'm not proud of how much I lean on dream imagery, maybe rather than dream narrative. But I think that many, many poets have made use of dreams. There was also something dreamlike about this whole experience of the pandemic. And also, I think living very quietly in Vermont and probably sleeping a lot, I might have remembered my dreams better. I'm really not sure.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's hard to know what's memory and what's dream. And I'm sure I'm not alone in having had the experience of a dream that does feel proleptic or anticipatory or prophetic.
Yeah.
Trying to get to school, you can't get there. There are barriers, you can't get into the room. Let's see, there's a question from Sarah. Is that okay? Can I look in the chat?
Yeah, let's do some of the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question in the chat and it's from Sarah. And the question is, everything flows so amazingly. I'm curious if the poem picks the form or if you as the writer chooses it. Now that's a good question. And both of you.
That's to both of us, Sarah. I don't know if it's, I'll answer it and then Judy can answer it if she wants. And Judy had spoken about my use of couplets. I would say rhyme and rhyme couplets are kind of a motor for me. They help me. They're like the rungs on a ladder or a motor. They keep me moving and keep the poem from kind of subsiding into a static puddle. When I was younger, I might say, okay, I'm going to write a villanelle. I'm going to write a sonnet. I'm a little less apt to do that now. Although if a poem is 15 lines or 13, I can tell it sort of wants to be a sonnet. But your question is a very good one that it's hard to answer. I do think there's such a thing as overthinking a poem. I've sometimes had students who say, well, I want my poem to be about this, and this is how long I want it to be, and this is the form. And I say, just start writing. So it's complicated, but in the last few years, I've certainly felt comfortable in couplets. I'm not sure why. Judy, what do you say about it?
Well, I think it's a brilliant question because it gets at sort of how it goes both ways. I start a poem with a couple of words or a phrase, something like that, and I look at it and then I think, where is this going form wise? And I try another one. And I've learned over the years what that tells me about what the poem is going to be like. And generally I use a very rough, but sometimes more tight iambic pentameter. That's my, that's where I start out. I can wake up in the middle of the night and do pentameter, that's easy. And then I roughen it up. So Sarah's question is good, because something about those first few phrases tells me, are there going to be rhyme? What kinds of repetitions are there going to be? What are the form, how am I going to handle the topic in a way? But one of the things that has been true for me all along is if I aim for a form past 5 to 10 lines, I cannot revise it into a different form. I can't, because the form asks you and draws the next line and the next line and the next line. So it's a very early pre-sketch. And once I think I know what the poem is asking for, I just have to go forward. And then if it's not, that poem goes in the drawer for a long time.
I think that Judy and I both, she's much younger than I am, and I was afraid to study with Robert Lowell at Harvard, so I studied with Robert Fitzgerald, who taught meter. But both Judy and I, and a lot of poets from our generation, have a kind of inner metronome. We can hear iambic pentameter. It's partly that we grew up reading it or how we were taught. So that's not a problem for either of us. I've tried to rough my pentameters up a little too. I also want to say that I love the refrain-like aspect of poetry. I don't use it a whole lot in this book, but I love forms like villanelles that repeat lines. So I don't want a poem just to be a versified essay. I do tend to write versified essays as I get older and more 18th century. Like The Cave, not The Cave Again, which I just read, but the first Cave is a sort of meditation in blank verse about C.S. Lewis's Narnia books. It mentions Plato. It's very bookish. It could obviously even be a lecture. And guess what? It's hard to publish poems like that. Nobody really wants them these days.
Right.
There's a lot of complaint among aging formalist poets, but that's okay.
Well, and we have another question here, and I'll just be the voice from the cloud as you two are on the screen. This is Kat. There is a question that we have, it's for both of you, and it's, are there Ukrainian poets you've started reading this year? But I want to back up for a minute and ask you both, how in your poetry are you addressing what's going on in Ukraine right now? I know Judy's got some poems about Ukraine.
I have a new poem, written around the vernal equinox, called Vernal Equinox, when the war was about a month old, that my husband, excuse me, is actually making a video of.
Oh.
So I'll report back to you on that, but I won't read it. I don't have a copy of it here, but it's a sort of a nightmarish poem about the war. And to answer your question, Andrea, let me just put this in the chat. There's a wonderful young Ukrainian, I'm not sure how long he's been in this country, poet named Boris Dralyuk, who just published his first book of poems in English called My Hollywood with Paul Dry Books. And My Hollywood is about Russian refugees in Hollywood.
Wow.
He's a very, very clever formalist, witty poet. He's also a translator of Isaac Baumel. He's also the editor of the LA Review of Books. And he's, young enough to be my son. He's now also the father of twins. I'm a big fan of Boris Dralyuk. There's also Ilya Kaminsky, of course, who has been in this country for a while and whose first book was called Dancing with Odessa. The younger ones, I'm not so sure, but it's a very rich, okay, Ilya Kaminsky, Jake Marmer. Okay, I don't know Jake Marmer. Judy?
Jake Marmer is also in America. He's he writes in English now. He's also a young man from but from Ukraine. So he's somebody who's also written a lot. I've translated a Ukrainian poet named Mariana Savka, and there are a few of her books in English that I highly recommend. She's an amazing dynamo. So once Ukraine gained its independence, she set up one of the first, if not the first, Ukrainian language children's press, a press for children's books, from infant to YA novels. And Mariana, she calls it the Old Lion Press. That's another name for Lviv is Leopolis. And so Mariana built this press, and then she opened a bookstore in Lviv. And as soon as the war started, she started doing some incredible things in addition to writing amazing poems, which you can see either by following her on Facebook. Well, I want to just finish the last thing she's been doing. So many refugees have come through Lviv. So she opened her bookstore for kids, and every week she has a kind of party for refugee kids who come from other parts of the country. And she's also raising money and going out to Kharkiv, where her press, where the actual printing press is, and beyond, to deliver vans and ambulances. She's been raising a huge amount of money. So if anybody's interested, I can turn you that way. But I want to say one thing that's about my press. Is founded by Askold Melnichuk, who is a Ukrainian American and a translator who has been creating for Arrowsmith Press a series of interviews with Ukrainian writers. So if the question is coming from like, who should we read? Please just follow Askold, and if either Kat or Max can put a link to those interviews, there's a series of them, very moving, very, very powerful. And one last plug, one of my Ukrainian poems is in an anthology called Ukrainian American Poets Respond. And we're having the book launch on Friday in New York at the Ukrainian American Institute. So come on down and hear what some Ukrainian American poets. I am a American Jew whose father was born in Poland, but in a place that is now Ukrainian. So I count, and partly it's because I've been there. My mom has, we went once with my mom and my father, and just fascinating pre any of this, of course. And I think I should be quiet. Once if you use the word Ukrainian, like I could go, and I should just shut.
There are all of these cross references. I mean, Boris Dralyuk has written about Ilya Kaminsky, and I hate to say it, but poetry flourishes in the most unlikely conditions. And those of you who are old enough to remember, people said, "Oh, after 9/11, how can people write poetry?" Or after the Holocaust, on the contrary, more poetry appeared. And as a Hellenophile, somebody who's pretty familiar with Greek literature, Ukraine has many, many Greek-speaking people. It has towns like Stavropol and Andriopol and Kherson, which are all Greek names. Catherine the Great decided to sort of send Russians into these Greek communities. And so for Greeks who are so interested in the Black Sea and in Greek colonies all over, we've all learned geography, we've learned history that we should have known anyway. So it's a very yeasty time culturally. I want to just slide to a question that Kat sent me earlier in the week or last week about who my favorite writer or piece of literature is. That's really hard. I would hate to have to choose, right? and maybe whatever I'm reading right now, or whatever I go back to that has more meaning for me, like the great Greek poet of the diaspora, Cavafy, who means more to me all the time. And I was reading a beautiful book about Keats, which I recommended to Judy, sent me back to Keats. But as I get older, I know more what I like, but I also try to keep an open mind. And you know, there's no one thing. We're living in a time of extreme cultural sensitivity when people are being condemned for all kinds of things, and I try not to get onto that particular bus, but I really couldn't name one particular favorite writer right now. I'm learning about new writers as we sit here.
Right. And Judy, what about you? Favorite writer, or how better question would be, what poets are you reading now?
Let's see, this is always tricky. It's one of those things where I know that's the question somebody's going to ask in an interview, and I prepare the list, and then my mind goes blank. What I want to say is I am right now going backwards mostly. The reading group that Kat and Rachel and I all met in is reading Ovid right now. Before that, we read Dante, and those poets mean a lot to me, both. And it's kind of hard to say. It's one of those things where I feel like if I say a contemporary poet, I'll miss somebody, or so I'm going to slide past that question. But in seriousness, here's one. Here's one. He's not alive anymore, so it doesn't really count. But I've been rereading Derek Walcott lately, who is just endlessly rereadable. His use of language is is dazzling. Various languages of the King's English or the Queen's English, Creole, and everything in between. So I've been reading one of his last books, White Egrets, which is a pun on white regrets, and it's quite good.
The poets I've been reviewing in the last year and a half for the Times Literary Supplement, I'm forgetting the name of the Yemeni American poet, but she wrote a wonderful book called The Wild Fox of Yemen. And Andres Nafis Saheli, again, global. He is, I think his mother, one of his parents was Italian and one was Iranian, and he spent time in Egypt. He's now teaching in California. So many diasporic and international poets. And James Merrill, who I was lucky to know well in the last 20 years of his life, has continued to inspire me, even as I see limitations in his work I didn't used to. I'm much more a Merrill fan than a Lowell fan, but that's okay.
You know, I know we're reaching the end of the conversation, but you know, I want to put on the gloves and we can duke it out, because one book I am reading is a very interesting compilation of some unusual autobiographical writing that Robert Lowell wrote, and it just came out. And when I mentioned it to Rachel, who's usually a very reliable book recommender to me, for example, the LaCosta Miller about Keats was just to die for. You answered me with, I mean, I don't want to overly sour, but it was a short, like, well, you know, he's had a bad influence on too many people. True, but Lowell is worth it. Still, there was a very bad review in the New York Times Book Review this week that didn't get at what's great about Lowell or this particular volume, but And we can discuss Meryl too, because I've become more and more involved. I read him more closely.
This
So,
Poetry is very patient. Poetry will always wait, it'll
Yeah.
wait until you pick it up again.
yeah.
I agree. And, that's absolutely true. I want to thank the two of you for this really, for me, a very enlightening conversation, and also one that was full of sort of tone and intensity, exactly the sort of conversation we seek to present here at Birchbark. And I'm grateful to both of you and to everyone for coming this evening. If you have questions, please shoot Birchbark Editing an email with your question. For example, we will try to post on Facebook a link to all of Osgood Melnichuk's interviews, and they're really fabulous interviews, as well as some of the other things that have been mentioned. And I'm just going to chime in with one last thing and say that the Keats book that Rachel and Judy have been mentioning, La Costa Miller, fabulous. You have to read it. You've got to get a hold of it. So on that note, I want to thank everybody very much for joining us this evening. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay in touch. Keep reading. Thank you, Kat.
Bye.